Hello and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutlick.
And today we're going to cover something that we kind of talked about covering.
Yeah, the New 52, which I've mentioned on this podcast many times before, as have you.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's kind of why we were both eager to do it, is we both believe it had a little more impact than some people give it credit for. And as I mentioned on the last episode, there was an early Dissecting Fiction video on the New 52, but I never quite felt like we got into the real important aspects of it on that. So we're coming back to it, and we're going to look at it from probably a little bit of a different perspective than on that video.
Right now, the New 52 is kind of important to me just because that's how I started getting to comics. Like I mentioned on the Hickman podcast, Fantastic Four books were kind of my first books. But I only did that because the New 52 was coming out at that point. And I was trying to just find a launch board into this whole comic universe.
Which is interesting because a lot of the impetus of the New 52, this line-wide relaunch, that's really maybe only comparable to post-crisis DC, but even that I don't feel like was as drastic as this. This is very much targeted to bringing in new readers, which is funny because in your case it did.
Yeah, but I don't know how successful it was at keeping me because, as we'll get into it, it was very confusing. To get into the broader aspects of the New 52, the New 52 is kind of an entire relaunch of all the comics DC was publishing at the time, and the goal was to release 52 comics.
Also, a definite rearranging of what they were doing. There was a very deliberate effort to vary topics, keeping things within the DCU, but maybe throwing more of a horror spin on it, throwing a Western spin, throwing a military spin.
Yeah, it was a lot of experimentation because they were trying to reach new audiences. They were just trying to test a lot of new ideas, and that's what the relaunch was about on the surface. But behind the scenes, it was also about expanding the market. And the big push was trying to do day one digital with all the comic books.
When they launch the New 52 with Justice League 1, which comes out the same day as the end of Flashpoint, which will let into it, but Justice League 1 is the first New 52 book, they made a humongous deal that it was going to be day one digital, which now is, okay, yeah, whatever. But the only reason it's okay, yeah, whatever, is because they did it there.
New 52 started that, and then they also, a big part of it was trying to expand into Barnes & Noble's bookstores and things like that. Because at this point in the industry, everything was pretty localized to just comic book stores.
Yeah, and comic book stores at that point, arguably now too, weren't doing really that well. Sales had been dropping in 2011 for about 4 years. There were only a few more than 2,000 comic book shops in the country. I'd like to try to find out the number now. If it was 2,000 in 2011, there's no way it's higher.
No, I feel like a lot of them consolidated it too. An example, in New Jersey, Joker's Child was saying they bought a new comic book store and they were organizing their stock according to that.
And that's sort of the direction the industry's gone since the New 52. But there's a lot to talk about with the New 52, concepts it brought to the table, and just sort of where it began. To prove that, I'm going to see. Normally when we have a show to do, we make a little run sheet to help ourselves out. I think I have about 16 pages here just because of the amount of books we're going to touch upon. I think cover is not fair. We're going to touch upon the entire launch of the New 52 and then go a little further too.
Yeah, because like we said, there's 52 new comics after launch of this. A lot of them are just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what happens, Even beyond that too, it was confusing to get into because as a new comic book reader, I remember buying Justice League #1. They say this is where you start. And right off the bat it was Superman and Batman fighting Darkseid, and I had not much context of Darkseid. And even before that, they were releasing articles saying Batman was actually fighting crime 5 years before the start of Year Zero, and all these characters just getting wiped out.
Yeah, it's super, super bizarre. Because here, I'm going to pull, these are two official quotes that were coming out within a few weeks of each other. So we have, at that point, Senior Vice President of Sales Bob Wayne saying, some of the characters will have new origins, while others will undergo minor changes. Literally around the same time as this, we have Bob Harris saying, everything that happened before would count.
It does not.
It does not. And I mean, you should immediately know that because they just told you some of the origins are changing. So if their origins changed, how did everything count?
Yeah, no, it was incredibly confusing, and the biggest point of that was like the Batman working 5 years before every other superhero, and you had this weird instance of like Batman going through 5 different Robins in 5 years before even the start of the Justice League.
When it was coming out, they were playing that up a lot because I think Batman's supporting cast is arguably the strongest in all of comics.
Oh yeah.
You have a lot of characters who rely on that progression of time, like Tim Drake, even Damian, and it all got so screwy by the time you restarted the New 52.
Yeah, and remember, this is before the Justice League #1 even came out, and this is like my introduction to comics, just like walk into this already convoluted timeline of like people saying this is happening and then immediately walking it back.
So I found that quote I was trying to quote before. Bob Harris at a panel said, we're not ignoring the past, explicitly when they're talking about the New 52, with another editor jumping in and saying everything counts, which is not true.
No.
Not by the time you get to the issue ones, and certainly not a few issues in.
Well, we'll go through every single of these 52 comics, or at least touch upon them. Basically, immediately, they try to make a new universe, while kind of acknowledging what people think of these characters, but ultimately trying to pull away from that and make something new.
Right, and they were also, something that I don't have specifically written down in the quote, but I remember distinctly, they talked about the idea of how comics had veered away from being comics and were getting too wordy and
Bendis.
Ironically working now for DC, but doing some of the best work he's ever done, which is interesting. But those were criticisms that were around at the time, that they were going to try to be more action-focused and make it more accessible, to make comic books the primary place to learn about superheroes, which might be the biggest failure of the New 52.
Oh, absolutely. There's DC Rebirth now, which is basically retconned everything, really, that happened in the New 52. And now we have Doomsday Clock, which is probably going to recontextualize even Rebirth and the New 52.
Yeah, they're definitely moving to another... I think recontextualization is a good way to describe it. And also, comic books, as far as superhero media, are probably the least popular right now. We've got TV rolling really well. We've got movies. There are distinct failures in the intent of the New 52.
The popular notion back then, at least when I was online on places like the dreaded 4chan, was that like comic books were becoming like an idea house for movies. And that they were basically just testing things to see like how it would work in a market. And then maybe pulling some of that into a movie or a TV show. And that's why the New 52 got so kind of like wild with all its ideas. But it's interesting you brought up that comic books were getting too wordy back then. It's because this was, 2011, right?
Yeah, and you'd even had, outside of Bendis, not to attack him so directly, but Let's be honest, New Avengers was probably the wordiest Avengers book ever written. Maybe Hickman, but Hickman was always stylized.
Because, 2006, I would say, to, 2011, comics were trying to emulate TV a lot. And that's just a popular trend across all mediums, really. You even see it in video games. And you saying they were trying to do something action-focused makes a lot of sense for all of these titles.
So I think what we should do, and what we kind of plan to do, and it's going to take a little time, but it will be worth it, is we're going to go through each of the New 52 titles, these launch New 52 titles, because New 52 continues on further than that. We will get into that as well. And we're going to talk about impact, if any, and what maybe it led into. These are in no particular order, by the way.
They're in alphabetical order.
They're not, look.
Oh, they're not.
They are not. Because I was pulling from old press releases, and...
So these are probably, by release date.
They might be by release date. Well, let's make that a contest. No, we're not going to pick a cut because I don't feel like doing that research either. Maybe they're by release date. Maybe you comment they were. Go ahead and do that. So let's kick it off with an A.
Aquaman.
Aquaman by Jeff Johns and Ivan Reyes. I would say one of the winners of the New 52.
Yeah, I don't think it had a long-term impact on Aquaman because the DC movies pulled so heavily away from like any kind of Aquaman in the comic books. But
I would disagree with that. I feel like there's a lot of the trench.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of the trench, but like the Aquaman like comic book character, like the way he looks, like the DC movies pull a really hard away from that. You know, they have Jason Momoa like tattoos and long hair, and then in the comic books he's a blonde guy.
But I think, that it's interesting with the Momoa design is very much that 90s Aquaman.
Yeah.
With, and tattoos weren't like quite as prominent as they were,
But this Aquaman book did help a lot with like making him more action oriented because the first arc of this was the trench, like you just mentioned, where they're fighting like deep sea creatures, and it was very bloody, and it was actually very enjoyable thanks to Ivan Reyes' art.
Then I think Jeff Johns deserves a lot of credit on it too.
Yeah,
he really created a cast for Aquaman with the not the Outsiders.
There were some of them were the Outsiders.
Were they called the Outsiders?
It's in later in the list too because they make a spin-off book.
Oh yeah, we'll get to that. But they really added a nice amount of detail to Aquaman that had been lacking for a good amount of time at that point.
Yeah.
There had been attempted relaunches of Aquaman in years prior. None of them really took off, and they were all very concept-y. There's the Sub Diego thing where a bunch of humans ended up being able to breathe underwater. There was the brainwashed King Arthur Aquaman type thing. There was a lot.
I just remember him having a hook.
Yeah, because there's even after that he has the water hand. There were a lot of attempts, and I think Jeff Johns admirably got him back to being a character that was very usable.
Yeah, no, because he focused in on a lot of complaints about Aquaman because even to this day, the super best friends thing, the Justice League from the 60s and 50s, haunts Aquaman to this day because the joke is he just talks to fish.
I think that's even gotten worse with the advent of the internet. I think it would have been so much easier to break away from that if people weren't still bombarded with it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I remember distinctly Aquaman #1, he makes jokes about that. He explains he's not talking to fish, he's controlling fish.
Right.
Another point I want to bring up is about Jeff Johns because he kind of spearheaded this entire relaunch. He was on a lot of big books. He was on Justice League. That was the biggest one of them all.
Which is interesting that we see it that way because I always got this feeling he always seemed really resistant to the way it was going. And I can't help but feel that leaving Wally West behind in all of this was 100% intentional in case they ever needed to do Rebirth, which they did.
I don't know about that, but I imagine him being pretty reluctant about it because I think you said there was a lot of behind-the-scenes drama, too, because people were just kind of running. They were hitting the floor running. Nobody knew what the continuity was.
Yeah, I heard a lot of that around that time, and I think it's sort of obvious. I don't think you even really need to hear it. I think if you look at the directions the books were going, it's not really a question.
Well, it hits two books really hard, which we'll get to. Moving on, there's Batman the Dark Knight, not Batman and the Dark Knight.
Yeah, and that was David Finch started out on that with art, and Jason Fabok also working on that. Eventually, Greg Hurwitz takes over as well. Batman the Dark Knight's kind of an underrated book. It was cool, and when you got into the Hurwitz run, it got real dark. It was about as close to Vertigo Batman as ever has been published. I would say even more so than the Black Label stuff right now.
This is part of the action orientation of the New 52 because the Dark Knight was known for being the bloodier of all the Batman books.
And it definitely is. If you read the Dark Knight, like I said, it verges on that Vertigo-esque sort of Batman that we've all thought about that never got to happen.
And it's pure action. There's not really any plot in it. At some points you have Two-Face becoming One-Face and becoming a big hulking Hulk monster. And they just punch each other.
Yeah. That's a good summation. Also, a new Wonder Woman #1, Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chiang. Also one of the more successful books in that run.
This is probably my favorite out of the first 52 because I have number 1 signed by Azzarello and Cliff Chiang, and I think it's partly because Cliff Chiang has a really good art style, like a very comic booky art style that's not too bloody, but it's very distinct.
And it allows him, it's funny you mentioned the bloodiness, because it allows him to get pretty violent without it seeming gory, which was really good in this version of Wonder Woman because she was very much a warrior.
Yeah, and that's what Azzarello plays with. He tries to really tone in on like the Greek and warrior aspect because before that it was more like pantheon heavenly-esque. But here he brings in a lot of like new god stuff, which is really cool actually.
I think what's interesting with it though is even as well reviewed as it was, it's one of the ones that got stepped back the most when Rebirth came out. They really went back to a more traditional Wonder Woman. Now, that's not to say elements of this didn't remain, because they did transition the character kind of smoothly from this version to the current version. But you would almost think that this book would have had more of an impact because of how well received it was. So we also have, and this is one of the first signs of this trying to access different genres more frequently. We have Jeff Lemire and Alberto Ponticelli. I think I got that. Alberto Ponticelli. On Frankenstein, Agent of Shade. A really cool, bizarre book. I don't know if you got into that really. But...
I got into it. I had at least Lemire's run in that book. Because this book is also a victim to what happened onto a bunch of books in that the writer and artist usually just like leave after like 12 issues or even like 6 issues depending on the book. And Frankenstein the Agent of Shade was another victim of that. And this was kind of like premise was basically it was just Frankenstein as a super agent. And he'd go around and like kill monsters with like machine guns and swords.
I just wanted to point out you said just Frankenstein as a secret agent. Because to me, I would never put just in front of that.
But it was a really cool book, and I liked how he wrote Frankenstein. He was closer to like the Mark Shelley version, where he's like reciting poetry as he like gussed werewolves in half.
Yeah, I think it is one that holds up too, and that was a book that was going to be niche no matter what you did.
Yeah.
And I think it still is. I think it's still incredibly readable, but for people who are going to be interested.
I would have liked it if they brought it into Rebirth, but I'm not surprised they haven't either.
Frankenstein's around though, and it is certainly a Frankenstein that leans towards that. One of the biggest concepts introduced in the New 52 is Red Hood and the Outlaws. Even when this came out, it was a little bit controversial. People weren't happy with the very, very sexualized Starfire and sort of backwards cap tattoo having arsenal. But you know what? It lasted
a long time.
I think Scott Lobdell was very smart to use Jason Todd when he was very much at the center of Batman for a long time. And it's also backed up by art from Ken Rocafort, which still is one of the best in the business. I think he might be objectively the best artist working. I think he should be on every huge book, and I don't get to see his art enough.
Damn.
I think that was a huge part of this, is you had... even like we said, with the controversy of how sexualized Starfire was and, how these characters were being portrayed, I think he helped it get over that because he just rendered everything so well.
I think the controversy helped it. Not in a good way, but it did definitely help with sales at first, I would say.
Yeah, definitely it piqued interest.
This is my introduction to the Red Hood. I had no idea who this character was. I think I might have saw a DC animated film. This was so bizarre for me to walk into as like a comic book like newbie because my Starfire was the Teen Titan Starfire from like 2003, where she's like a princess that's kind of in awe of everything.
Which is interesting you say that because I think that's where a lot of that came out too, was you had a lot of the fan base who that's how they saw Starfire.
Yeah.
I saw Starfire as New Teen Titans.
Right,
George Perez.
Even this version pulls away from that.
It pulls away from it, but, the costume she was wearing in the George Perez one, if you were to highlight it a little bit, is pretty much that anyway. So I think it was less shocking in my head because I knew that's what the costume could look like.
Red Hood and Outlaws also kind of exemplifies what was kind of going wrong with the New 52. Is like they were trying to bring in new fans, but then they introduced a Starfire that no fan really recognized.
it also, while trying to claim this idea of being progressive, is really going back to sort of 90s tricks.
Yeah, the whole New 52 line is very 90s. And then on top of that, you have like Red Hood and Arsenal, who are like sidekick characters that most people don't really know of, starring in their own book. It's very like jarring going in as a new comic book person.
That's an interesting perspective, because I didn't really have that at all, but I could see that if you only had limited knowledge of Arsenal or Starfire, how jarring that would be. Up next, we have The Flash. Francis Manipool with Brian Bucaleto. That one I'm not sure.
Yeah, this one I bought for the art.
A lot of people bought this for the art, but once again, another one that has a lot of impact. A lot of the Flash TV show derived from this. This is like your first return to a very pure Barry Allen since he dies in Crisis on Infinite Earths. When he came back, it was always paired with Wally and all these other speedsters that had like come to prominence since then. This really brings back things to sort of square one for the Flash.
Yeah, it was also a bit more grounded than the other ones, which I kind of like. Not super grounded. Like the first issue has, Captain Cold freezing an entire like river and having all that cool art, like of the ships in the air and everything.
Also, beautiful colors on those books.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what helped it last so long and like the impact that it had. But also you kind of see what I mentioned earlier about like this being an ideas house for like other like TV shows and movies to pull from.
I would say what's interesting about The Flash to me, though, is even now, it's still really coming out of this Flash number one. Yeah, we've reintroduced a lot of the characters who disappeared in the New 52 since. But this Barry Allen we have now is very much the Barry Allen that kind of appears in this Flash one.
And it was also like a weird red flag, though, because people were like, where's Wally? Where's all the other Flashes?
Right, it was one of the first books where it proved that what they had said before about everything counting was not true.
A lot, and they don't even mention Flashpoint, I don't think, in that first issue either.
Fury of Firestorm, one that doesn't immediately jump to mind. Ethan Van Sciver and Gail Simone, backed up by Yildiray Cinar. It is an odd pair, especially now these days. Back then, I don't think anyone thought it was an odd pair, but that's a good commentary.
Very odd pair.
I enjoyed that book. I was always a big Firestorm fan. I liked having both Jason and Ronnie available, and then they turned into like scary monster Firestorm. Yeah, cool concept. Not sure how many people it brought in.
0. I remember reading that. I was kind of thinking like I did not have an idea what was going on. I was not interested by Firestorm at all because they did a terrible job about like explaining his powers and everything. And especially when it's like this Firestorm that's two different characters. It felt oddly aimless.
And this is where that starts to creep in, I think. We've named a lot of books that actually were fairly solid. That sort of confusion about what's really going on in the DCU could be exemplified in Fury of Firestorm. Yeah. You start to see this, okay, what counted, what didn't. And it's funny because I'm looking at the next couple of books, and they also are starting to get down that road, too.
Yeah.
Savage Hawkman, Tony Daniel and Philip Tan.
Woof.
I liked it.
Woof.
But once again, if everything counted, it is disarming. This
is somebody that only knew like Hawkgirl from Justice League Unlimited, and I was like, oh, Hawkman's like a dude of Hawkgirl.
So this is very much like a Space Conan Hawkman, which I appreciate very deeply, but ultimately didn't go too far.
Well, it's like they tried to do a Space Conan, which they do in the Green Lantern show, much better than in here, because they make him like a space archaeologist too, like a space Indiana Jones. But they kind of pull away from that almost immediately.
He's more distinctly alien than he had been in a long time in Savage Hawkman. I think with all the work Jeff Johns had done in years prior, it's probably off-putting to some fans.
It was very off-putting to me. I had no idea what was going on in this book.
Up next, The Green Arrow, J.T. Krull, with art by Dan Jurgens. I just remember being very confused about that costume, and I don't think I could tell you a single thing about that book.
I don't remember anything. I don't know if I bought it. I might have.
Justice League International, now written by Dan Jurgens, with art by Aaron Lopresti. And this is where another one where things get confused, because this is very distinctly referring to things that happened in continuity.
Yeah, I knew vaguely about Booster Girl, but they also made that Booster Girl not the Booster Girl from before.
But at the same time, they were trying to access some of that
like my
character
weird knowledge, like from Justice League shows and like just weird things I've heard online about him. Because Booster Girl had like a big online fan base.
Still has a big online fan base, and a lot of people forget that there was a book, another Justice League team book with Booster Gold leading into this. That was Justice League Generation Lost, which actually ran as like a full title.
Yeah.
And this seemed like it was going to pick up from that, and of course it doesn't really.
At all. And it's kind of confusing too because like it's aimless and then it introduces a lot of characters too. And this is kind of like the BC list book for BC list characters. But it's so many characters being introduced at once and it's very jarring where it fits into the context of everything else.
And we have a couple others. Some of these we're going to breeze over a little more. Mr. Terrific #1, Eric Wallace with Roger Robinson on art. Captain Atom #1, J.T. Krull writing with Freddie Williams II on art. Freddie Williams, who had been getting a lot of work prior to the New 52 at DC. DC Universe Presents #1, Paul Jenkins, Bernard Chang. That was a Deadman story that launched with that.
Oh, is that what it was?
Yeah.
I remember buying the Deadman thing. I just don't remember.
And that was
the
DC
title.
Universe Presents #1, which becomes a short-lived anthology. Another big one, Green Lantern #1, Jeff Johns with Doug Menke on art and Christiaan Almi backing him up. We're coming off a period here where Green Lantern and Batman were probably the top two characters in the DCU. This book is one of the first to access that idea that Justice League is taking place earlier. So Sinestro is now the Green Lantern for 2814. Gets messy really quickly.
Yeah, he doesn't help himself later on either with what Jeff Johns is doing because he introduces several new Green Lanterns as well. Again, it's just throwing spaghetti to the wall and seeing what sticks. But it is, you're right, it's the first one to kind of talk about continuity. And I think that's only because Jeff Johns is writing it. And he's the only one with a vague idea what's going on.
We'll take back our little time machine to 2011 where I just reminded you that Green Lantern was one of the biggest titles that DC was publishing. And that's why we also got Green Lantern Corps #1 by Peter Tomasi with Fernando Passarin and Scott Hanna on art. We also got Green Lantern The New Guardians with Tony Bedard. Art by Tyler Kirkham.
I forgot how many Green Lanterns books.
We also got Red Lanterns #1, written by Peter Milligan, art by Ed Vanez and Rob Hunter. All solid teams in a very weird position, being the B and C books to a relaunch. That's really all I can even think to say about that. There was some cool stuff that happened early on when it was still kind of coming off of that pre-Flashpoint line, but they get lost too.
I don't even remember New Guardians. I remember Red Lanterns because that was like another action book.
New Guardians was Kyle Rayner's book, basically.
Oh, were you against the White Lantern?
He might have been a White Lantern. Yeah, it was different. Yeah, that was the premise, was it was different color lanterns were now making up the New Guardians who were no longer short blue men.
Right, and I remember guys who were mad at this one because they changed Kyle a bit.
Yeah, everyone was getting these sort of attitude adjustments, if you will. And like we were saying before, they tend to lean a little 90s-y. Now we're going to get back a little bit to the Bat family.
There's so many Batman titles.
Yeah, let me see it. I'm just going to try to make sure. Holy crap. Okay. All right. We're not going to mention the one that obviously we are going to eventually mention. Detective Comics, of course, restarts at #1. Tony S. Daniel writing and on art. Actually pretty well received at the time, and introduces that version of the Joker where he cuts off his face.
Yeah, and the cover's known for having his skull on the floor.
Yep.
Very bloody.
Batman and Robin #1.
I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and it picks up from, once again, some of the pre-Flashpoint stuff and is a little cleaner than other ones. That was Peter Tomasi with Pat Gleason, team that would later go on to do Superman at Rebirth. Dwayne Swarzinski and Jesus Saez on Birds of Prey 1, where we get heroic Poison Ivy. Catwoman #1 by Judd Winnick and Guillaume March. A little controversy when that came out. Very sexualized.
Very 90s.
Very 90s. But written by Judd Winnick, so it's actually pretty good.
Yeah,
it wasn't that bad.
Once you get over the first arc hump, it balances itself out a bit more.
The relaunched Batgirl #1, where no longer has Barbara been shot through the spine by the Joker, written by Gail Simone, with, really interestingly here, art by Ardian Saif and Vicente Cifuentes. Saif, as we all know, no longer in the industry due to anti-Semitic art being placed into X-Men Gold #1. Batwoman #1, J.H. Williams III with Hayden Blackman, art by Amy Reeder.
Amy Reeder was on and off that book. It was very bizarre. There was like some kind of weird arguments between her and J.H. Williams.
And there's always seems to be problems with Batwoman books.
I don't know what it is, but that book was really great because of the art was really amazing. I loved the art in that book.
Nightwing #1 by Kyle Higgins and art by Eddie Barrows actually holds up quite well.
Also caused controversy because they changed the blue to a red.
Yep. Which then made him look like Robin and Batman and Robin, which I kind of enjoyed, but that's okay. But Nightwing #1, another one where you didn't really feel like the character broke too much. He was in new situations, but it was...
No, but it was weird because they had a weird relationship with Batgirl too. Like, both Nightwing and Batgirl had the same problems. Like, you didn't really know what the relationship was.
Right, because so much history now had been...
Gone.
Yeah,
gone. No one knows what's going on.
Batwing #1, written by Judd Winnick, art by Ben Oliver. This is the Batwing who was from Africa.
I wanted this to be better than it was.
I think everyone did, because the costume was really cool and the concept was good. It just never really went anywhere. And we'll establish this now. Don't look at that as so much as the writers. I'm sure editorial was running all over the place at this point.
Yeah, I remember Batwoman had a bunch of problems with editorial at this time.
That brings us to what I think is sort of indisputably the biggest book of the New 52, Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's Batman.
Everyone expects a Batman book to be good, but nobody really expected Batman #1 to be this good. Scott Snyder wasn't an underground writer at this point, but he was known for only a handful of short Batman runs at this point.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people had confidence in him, but like you were saying, this is a real case of what comics can do that no other genre can. This was a combination of really cool art along with really good writing. I don't know if through the whole New 52 he was as consistent, but what I can say is in a time where people weren't buying a lot of books, almost everyone I knew who read comics read Batman.
This book played a lot with the medium too. Like, you had to turn pages upside down, turn them sideways, which is kind of a 90s gimmick. But the way Greg Capullo pulls it together, it's very, like, you get into the headspace of Batman. And I think what also helped this book was Scott Snyder's really focused exploration of Batman, because unlike a lot of Batman books, he was talking a lot about, like, how Batman exists in the city. And it was a lot about the city and Batman, not so much about Batman and the villains and crime.
I think you're right on that. It also just helped on a practical point of view because continuity was so screwed up. Having a place where you didn't have to worry about that as much worked really well. And he always kept the focus. And, like I said, regardless of how strong each arc was, you always felt like you were reading the same characters. Mm-hmm. And having Greg Capullo on for so long and so consistently really gave you a consistent image of Gotham and Batman.
Right, and I also think, like, this is the rare instances where the reboot helped the book, because Scott Snyder could really play around what this city was like. Like, at this point, Bruce Wayne was trying to rebuild the city, and that was something that didn't really happen in any other Batman book.
And Snyder also, at the beginning of this, is writing Swamp Thing with art by Yannick Paquette. Also a very cool book. Between that and Animal Man by Jeff Lemire, art by Travel Foreman and Dan Green, we get into the rot and the green and the red and all these forces surrounding the DCU that are also being used pretty readily in media now.
Yeah, this was something this is kind of the first instances of them trying to build a new world in the New 52, and the Rot World arcs kind of ruined both of the books. But I remember really loving Animal Man, or at least Jeff Lemire's Animal Man, because it is kind of a scary book.
Yeah, it's definitely a horror book. It's definitely more in line with Swamp Thing than anything else.
Yeah, I remember like the first couple of issues of Swamp Thing being good, but then it gets so far off the wheels, and then it's just nothing really happens for several issues.
Also around this time, as we're talking and getting to this more horror-y side, we get a few other books that lean that way. Justice League Dark, Peter Milligan, Michael Janin. Not the most successful book, but conceptually that's something that survived.
Because this is such a strong concept. It was basically just like magic Justice League, and you had Constantine and a bunch of other like wizards running around solving magic crimes. And that's something that's easy to like work with.
Also, in that same line, Demon Knights, Paul Cornell, Diogenes Neves, and Auclair Albert on art on that. We were talking about this a little bit before we started recording. Really cool book. Mm. Just another one that kind of gets lost in this confusion of what's really going on in the DCU.
It also just didn't fit into the larger universe either. And I think that's something that really harmed it. And it harmed a lot of books in the New 52.
Resurrection Man, Dan Abnett, Andy Lanning, with art by Fernando Dagnino. Yeah, it was a Resurrection Man book that came out. I remember even thinking at the time, sort of bizarre choice to lead a book in a relaunch.
I stuck with that book for a while for reasons I'm not really sure of.
It wasn't bad. I remember reading and being okay with it. It just didn't seem like something that was going to draw a lot of attention, and I don't think it did.
Because I think I stuck with it because I thought they were going to bring in like the dreaming and stuff. Because they had angels show up at one point.
Yeah, and they did kind of... This is another thing. Right before we got to the New 52, they were bringing in some of that Sandman cast more into the DCU. That would have been a reasonable assumption. Josh Fialkov and Andrea Sorrentino on iVampire. Got good reviews out of the gate. Ended up having a lot of problems.
Yeah, behind the scenes. It got railroaded pretty hard by editorial. It was like forced its way into like being a Batman book. A lot of stuff happens in it, like this whole vampire wars, and then like none of it gets brought up in any other book, oddly enough.
Also, in a quasi-horror vein, we have Voodoo #1, Ron Mars, and Sami Basri. Voodoo, the first Wildstorm character we're mentioning here.
Yeah, that was the other quote-unquote big thing. Like, to me, it didn't really mean anything. Like, Wildstorm being part of the New 52, what does that mean?
Well, that's funny, because that's another difference. You're just coming in. That was really cool to me, that Wildstorm was going to be there. And it looked very much like they were building to some kind of big Wildcats event. They had Hellspawn showing up with Superman.
Yeah.
They had Grifter has his own book. We'll get to that. And they had other books that were Wildstorm-centric. I remember Voodoo kind of falling apart right away.
Because it was trying to be like a sexy spy thriller, but like nobody really knew what was going on. And then on top of that, like with Wildstorm coming in, I would think they would do a planetary book.
We have a couple of books that we're really going to breeze over.
Yeah.
As we're getting down, I don't know if this was in a list of relevance at some point, but no, it can't be, because there's still a couple of relevant things we haven't run into. Legion Lost, Fabian Naiches and Pete Woods, which was a team of Legionnaires lost in our time. Legion of Superheroes #1 was Paul Levitz and Francis Portela. It's a Legion book. Struggling with knowing what even the time is going on there. It's tough. Teen Titans #1, Scott Lobdell, art by Brett Booth and Norm Ratmund, does introduce a couple of characters that have made it out.
Is Bunker still around?
Bunker's still around, yeah.
Okay, that's the one character I remember.
Another place where the confusion of how much time has passed, what the hell's going on, because we have Tim Drake there as Red Robin in that bizarre wingsuit.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you really start to see like the weaknesses there. Static Shock #1, John Rosen, Scott McDaniel.
This one really hurt.
Especially because that character was so primed at that point to take off.
Yeah, because he had a very successful TV show, and like I was excited for this book. And then they started introducing clones in the very first issue, and you're like, why can't you just adapt a TV show? I would have been fine with that. Just have like the babies and shit like that.
Hawk and Dove, written by Sterling Gates, who's coming off of Supergirl. Art by Rob Liefeld.
The strong 90s in this one.
Just a bizarre choice in general. I remember Liefeld getting very defensive about things at a certain point online. Just... Yeah, there's not much. This
is
once
the
again,
height of Liefeld.
We're hitting a lot of these books, and the problem we're having is not so much that they're bad. It's just that they're unremarkable.
Yeah.
And if you're relaunching this line and you're making this huge deal about everything, you're getting hurt every time this happens. Stormwatch #1. Paul Cornell, Miguel Sepulveda, Another tip-off to that, what I think had to be an abandoned Wildcats plan. Blackhawks #1, Mike Costin, Ken Lashley. Cool idea, but I don't know if that warranted their own book. But once again, we're trying to explore these other genres, as we did in Sergeant Rock and the Men of War, which was a modernized Sergeant Rock, written by Ivan Brandon and Tom Derenick. Cool idea, didn't really pan out.
Yeah, trying to be a 50s war comic.
All-Star Western, #1, Palmiotti and Gray, with art by Moritat. This is really an extension of their run on Jonah Hex.
It's not surprising that one didn't launch off. They tried to make Jonah Hex a thing, but Cowboys just are not popular now.
Deathstroke #1 by Kyle Higgins, with art by Joe Bennett and Art Tibbert. Good book. Actually really solid all the way through.
Surprisingly. I thought it would have spun off the rails. I think Lifeblood was on at one point, right?
He might have done something on it. I'm trying, yeah. We can check that out. Maybe we'll go back and do it. You'll get a little thing where Christian goes, actually, he was on it.
Christian here with the canon update. Rob Liefeld was in fact on Deathstroke from issue number 9 all the way to issue 20 as writer and artist.
Grifter #1, Nathan Edmondson, art by, I think it's pronounced Cafu, I've never been sure. Once again, another thing leading to that potential Wildcats.
It exists.
OMAC #1 by Dan DiDio and Keith Giffen, with art by Keith Giffen and Scott Koblish. I like Dan DiDio. I have no problem with him. I can put that out there. I've had brief conversations with him at conventions. I've never felt like he's ever tried to do anything negative, but it always seems whenever he has his hands on books, it just doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah, he was trying to really make this book come off, but it was also, as somebody that's just coming into comics, what the fuck is an OMAD? What the fuck is this book?
It's a one-man army corps, right?
Yeah, but at this point, Batman took over a satellite. It was weird, and the art is very old school too. Very.
Suicide Squad #1, Adam Glass and Marco Rudy. Big because it is your first modern Harley Quinn.
Yeah, that Harley Quinn outfit launched 1,000 cosplays.
Yeah.
And 1,000 porn videos, really.
Yeah, probably.
This also influenced the later Margot Robbie Harley Quinn.
Yeah, I think that like we were saying, we're trying to look for where the real influence came out. I think the Suicide Squad #1 is undeniably a huge influence going forward.
But mainly because of the costume.
Mainly because of the costume, and I think the portrayal of Harley Quinn.
Yeah, even
you finally get that sort of rebel Harley Quinn where earlier you always had her sort of tied down to the Joker.
This was losing her away from Joker, and now she's kind of becoming her own character, especially now. Yeah, I didn't think of it like that. I guess this is her first, solo. There
was a solo book, but it was always... This is the first contemporary Harley Quinn. Blue Beetle #1, featuring Jaime Reyes, Blue Beetle to be specific, Tony Bedard, Iguara. Good book, didn't get enough credit. And now we get into the Superman family. Supergirl 1 by Michael Green and Mike Johnson, art by Mahmoud Asrar. Superboy #1 by Scott Lobdell, art by R.B. Silva and Rob Lean. That Superboy disappears pretty quickly. Supergirl kind of hangs around.
She gets a couple costume changes.
And by Rebirth, they've kind of straightened things out again. Yeah. She's back to being regular. Superman #1, which is intended to be the current Superman book. In fact, it was originally solicited as Superman, the Man of Tomorrow. So, Superman written by George Perez, art by Jesus Marino. Perez has come out and said that there was definitely a lot of confusion editorially with this book.
Oh, I imagine. It was, like many of the books, pretty aimless.
Part of the reason it was so confused was Action Comics #1, Grant Morrison and Rags Morales. Not that we're blaming this on Grant Morrison or Rags Morales, but they were charged with retelling the origin of Superman from a day one, and the concept Morrison went into it with was a superhero in a world that was completely unaware of the concept of superheroes.
And it was made even more confusing about what other superheroes were around and Superman discovering his power, and he also went back to much more roguey Superman, somebody who's more willing to break the rules and everything. He couldn't fly at this point. He could jump over buildings. Which
was intentional. Morrison wanted to sort of recapture the early Superman stories, and that was the idea, is this would be the new early Superman stories.
But It shows the failure of editorial at this point, like being unable to manage all these books and being able to like communicate two writers on like just two Superman books. Like neither of them had any idea what the other one was doing.
And the big number one, Justice League number one, which ends up leading into that story that ends up often called War.
I thought it was just called Trinity War.
No, that's a different thing.
Oh my god.
Jeff Johns and Jim Lee. That was, the attempt at the killer book that no one could ignore. No one could ignore it. Sold incredibly well.
Yeah. But I ignored it after like issue 3.
Yeah, I think I made it to 12. The issue here, and I say this just looking back at it, having looked back at it pretty recently, it is the epitome of the New 52. It's pretty, it's action-based, but when you're going through it, none of the characters feel like themselves.
Like, it was fine reading issue number 1, but it's so bizarre to read issue 1 and have them going straight to fighting Darkseid. Like, who are these characters? Or anything, like, whether they're relationships.
And they try to reestablish the relationships to be a little more tense. And while you can do that to a certain extent with the Justice League, you have to be careful. Because the Justice League is always coming together to make sure that the world is safe. And if Green Lantern is making, pot shots at Batman,
yeah,
it takes away from it. And I think that was the issue. They were trying desperately to figure out a way to make this appealing to a bigger audience. And I think they ultimately shot themselves in the foot.
There's also a problem like where the characters were acting in the Justice League, they were very different in their own book.
Right, and that was a huge issue across the line, was nothing seemed to really matter. If you wanted to read one book and it was good, it didn't really matter what that character was doing in the 3 other books they were in.
Yeah, no, I just read Animal Man. I was perfectly content. I didn't have to read anything else.
What that does is you kill this idea of relaunching the line to be really strong, because you're not relaunching the line to be really strong. You're relaunching it to try to hit different parts of the market all at once, but not really knowing what's going to work. And ultimately, a lot of it didn't.
Well, you would think like something like the Justice League would have a lot of impact on all the other books, and it never does for like almost the entirety of the New 52.
That's true. I barely read Justice League, and I never, until the New 52 was ending, I don't think really what was going on in Justice League felt like it mattered.
It really didn't. Like, if you needed New God stuff, you read Wonder Woman. Because they didn't talk about the New Gods really at all in Justice League.
Now, I have in front of me right now, I just want to tell everyone this, a list of everything that got canceled and re-added into the New 52.
The Slaughter.
So new books, old books. The Slaughter starts in January 2012. Now, mind you, these books are coming out in the fall of 2011.
Yeah.
So this is only like 3-4 months out. These books are starting to get canceled.
Justice League number 1 came out at the end of August, like the last Wednesday of August. And then September was all the new books.
I'm not even going to go through this. I thought we were going to, and I think we've spoken fairly competently on what were the real influences of the New 52. So we'll just kind of summarize this.
Yeah, it's a lot to go through because so many of these books just kind of pop up and then almost disappear within 6 months.
The Others, not The Outsiders.
The Others.
The Others, there you go. There are endless changes over, 4 years.
Jeez, man.
Until we get to Convergence and the DCU, which is sort of a placeholder. And that's into 2015. In 2016, DC starts teasing Rebirth, and then a month later, in February 2016, they announce Rebirth.
And Rebirth basically retcons most of what happens in the New 52.
But it also does this weird thing where they almost acknowledge how different these characters were when they were going through this New 52 thing. Through Superman.
Yeah.
Because the New 52 Superman at the beginning of Rebirth, though they do kind of go back and move this around too, is considered a different character. He's not Superman. Superman, who we knew from before Flashpoint, was alive this whole time and had a kid and everything. And the other Superman dies. And it was this weird sort of like symbolic sacrifice of the New 52, that your Superman is not Superman. But he was something.
It's weird. He wasn't my Superman, weirdly enough, because like even back then I could kind of acknowledge like this is not the Superman I wanted. It's weird because nobody had a strong attachment to him. Like, some people, like, cried a little foul, but nobody was, like, outraged over this.
And what's interesting is that it almost makes the New 52 better. Because now you're looking back at it, and it was like, this was a mistake, but it's like a mistake within the story, where something went wrong with time.
Yeah, it's an experiment, and how successful it was is up to debate. But I'm glad they at least tried to experiment.
Yeah, and I feel the same way now, too. It's funny. And at the end of the day, all of this is about the company making money. And in that sense, it became a disaster really quickly.
Because you have 52 books that, like, 48 of them fail.
And you have many fans, myself included, who would be buying, minimum 3-4 books from a publisher in a week. Where I was down to maybe 3-4 books from the publisher in a month.
It was so much money, and then immediately, like, so many people just started cutting their budget because it's just like, I can't buy all these books, and so many of these books just don't matter.
Ultimately, it serves as this big lesson to the entire industry, which is you can't throw out the legacy of your characters.
Yeah, but that's the interesting though. They were trying not to, but
They
they
said
did.
they were trying not to, but then
But then you have Green Lantern, where he's still very much the Jeff Johns Green Lantern. I mean, granted, it's being written by the same guy, but like, it's the same continuity and everything.
but on other sides of this, you're getting completely divergent stories. You're getting things that don't seem to line up with anything. And if this all happened to one character, how come this guy just showed up?
Yeah, no, that was a problem with like the Teen Titans, Red Hood. Like, a lot of Batman books had like these terribly confusing timelines, and like, you didn't know what characters were what. And the most successful of the Batman books just ignored all that. They just said, I want to just tell a good Batman story.
And I would say for the most part, even going forward, and a lot of stuff we didn't talk about specifically, that was kind of where there were successes. It was where the stories didn't really care about the rest of the DCU. The one that pops into mind, and this was during the DCU YOU initiative, is Grayson, where Tom King and Team Seeley just took this character and were like, all right, he is this guy with this skill set. We just faked his death in continuity. We have, like, carte blanche. Let's take him in a totally different direction than he's ever been taken. And it worked.
It worked really well.
It's almost like those concepts where they were focusing on the character were what they were trying to do 5 years earlier and couldn't.
There's a misguided aspect to all this where they're like just saying like, well, let's just try a book. And you're like trying all these Westerns, you're trying all these like war books. And like, maybe that worked in the 50s, but like, the market's not there anymore.
I agree with that. And I agree the market's not there. Not in the sense that people wouldn't necessarily want stories that were Westerns or wouldn't want war stories. But even by their own admission, they did not have the spread they used to. There's no comic books being sold at the corner store. Newsstands, if they get any comics at all, are like almost nothing. The opportunity for people who aren't already into comic books to read comics is very, very low. And, you can try to solve that with advertising. You can try to solve that through apps, through all these different things that have popped up. If you're talking about a physical comic book that people are going to collect and go back to, that market might be gone.
I know I just said, like, I don't understand why they were trying to do this, but it makes sense in a weird way where you're saying, like, well, we're going to be in Barnes & Nobles. We're going to be in the newsstands. Let's try this. Let's try that. But you're also right, like, the people that are interested in comic books, like, they're not going to just start buying this stuff out of nowhere. And the other big part of this was, like, trying to make trades and everything, too.
Which is something that still haunts the industry, this whole minimum 6-issue structure. I think is really hurtful to the form of the comic because there's less incentive to buy each issue. And some writers, I think, have figured that out and turned their back on this arc structure. I think a great example of that is Immortal Hulk. Those issues are very much written as issues. Yes, there is an arc, but if you miss one issue, it's going to mess you up. And every issue has something to keep you going. And a lot of writers I use that because it's a hot book right now, but there are plenty of writers who have turned back to that again. I think here they were so far away from it, and it became so indoctrinated to try to write these arcs that people were jumping off of books in the middle of stories because you could, because nothing was happening.
We didn't get into all the titles they canceled, but a lot of these books only last like 5 or 6 issues. And there would be titles like Clarion. And you'd be like, why are they announcing a Clarion book? And then like 2 months later, you find out they're making a trade of it. And it's only like issue 3. Or like Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld. At the same time, they're making TV shows like Princess Amethyst. And it's nothing like the comic book. It's them trying to expand an audience and just getting lost in the weeds like with these old archaic structure, like trying to fit into trades, trying to expand into like new marketplaces, and just it's like a landmine.
Which is funny the way you said that too, is that, you know, the trade structure itself is now archaic. Why couldn't you be marketing stronger single issues digitally?
Yeah, you could, because like that's the big thing with this is like it was making digital and made Marvel go digital too.
Regardless of how many failures there were through it, and I think no one is going to argue that there were substantially more failures than successes from the New 52.
Yeah, but I think the successes are big because they had a very long impact so far on like the books that it has impacted.
And what do you think those successes tell us?
I think a lot of it is visual. Like we just mentioned Harley Quinn's costume, but it also speaks to a larger like trying to divorce characters from like the context of what they were born in and trying to like find out what these characters are. Like Wonder Woman, for example, is less about like the Amazon stuff and it's trying to divorce her from the Amazon stuff and like put her into something else. And even with Batman too, it's trying to divorce Batman from like all the villains and trying to find something new in this.
And I agree with that. I think that is when you'd usually find most success with these long-running characters is, you know, Frank Miller talks about it as stripping the character down to nothing. That's what he was trying to do in Born Again. It's what he was trying to do in Year One. The character has to be strong enough to survive other situations. I think you're right. I think the successes of the New 52 were all found in that. They were all found in, here's the character, a very complete version of the character, and here's something you've never seen them do.
So New 52 is filled with both big successes and massive failures.
Yeah, I would say it's probably filled with a few big successes and then a ton of tiny little failures.
Yeah, that haven't really impacted the culture at all, outside of maybe like 1 or 2 books, as being the examples of like, what the fuck were they thinking?
Yeah, I think there was no real major negative impact outside of turning away some readers who would have stuck with titles if they had continued the way they were going. So I think that's about all we have to say on the New 52. We know what the next episode is going to be.
The teaser from last episode was very wrong.
It was, I mean, yeah, well, we wanted to do something in between because of the timing. And because we had talked about this so much, we're like, all right. Well, no, you said 90s, though, and we talked about how 90s the New 52 was.
Okay, sure.
Just stretch it. Stretch it. That's how you fix continuity. You stretch
it.
But we are going to do that very, very 90s show next time. We know everyone seems to really like the 90s. It's cool to like the 90s now.
I like the 90s.
It's about Power Rangers. It's not about Power Rangers. It is not a show about Power.
It's about the Rugrats.
Oh my god. I'm gonna give like a better, more specific hint. We are going to cover a figure from the 90s who is going to have something coming out in October.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good. People figure that out.
Because my hand was like, they like to talk about Star Wars. I'm like, who does
Yeah, well,
now?
combine that. Combine those two, and you'll figure it out. But in the meantime, please subscribe to this. Hit that little bell if you're on YouTube so you get the alerts when our new videos go up. Like, comment, share. You can find us on pretty much any social media you can think of, that I can think of. I guess I don't know all of them. We're on Vero, we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter.
Yeah, let us know what books you liked from the New 52, what you thought of it, like if it was successful for you or not. I mean, there's a lot of just like weird titles from the New 52 that are kind of interesting in their own little ways.
Yeah, this could really be almost a never-ending conversation on the New 52 because it was such a big event that had so many components. But we'd love to hear anything you have to say about that. But for now, we're going to sign off. Once again, I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Kutlick.
And thank you for joining us on the Dissecting Fiction podcast. Dun, 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 dun.